Hey guys, it's John from Humor and History. Hope you're all doing well. Today we're looking at the British occupation of Japan. I do have some videos that are probably going to come out just after this. There are videos I did ahead of time that are still the history buff, so just we'll cycle those through. And in the meantime, I thought this was an interesting one. So let's check out the British occupation of Japan. We don't study a lot about this in the U.S., even though the Pearl Harbor attack was pretty much the catalyst that got us into the war. Well, really the full catalyst, I guess, that got us into the war. But we don't talk a lot about the aftermath for Japan. So
At the end of World War II, the various Axis powers were treated differently. Italy had switched sides, so they remained intact. Germany, along with Austria, was divided into 4 occupation zones between the British, French, Americans, and Soviets, with the capital cities of Berlin and Vienna also divided into 4 zones. Japan, meanwhile, had some land annexed by the Soviets and gave Taiwan back to China. But in its home islands, they simply had a single American occupation zone. Well, okay, on the surface that is mostly true, and usually we like to quickly move on to the more dramatic Cold War. But there is one aspect of the occupation of Japan that is almost always ignored. While yes, it is true the home islands of Japan were on paper a single occupation zone under American General MacArthur, it was technically designated as an Allied occupied zone, not American occupied.
And so my understanding about this too is that when they talk about Allied occupation zone, what you're really talking about are mostly, I believe it's mostly Australian, but they're Commonwealth forces in the area. If my understanding serves me correctly, that even dwindled as well. It was something along the lines of China, after the war ended and the Japanese withdrew. Well, China went back to basically fighting their civil war, communists versus nationalists. France was still rebuilding. I mean, I think it had one or two. It probably had like 2 armies in the field towards the end of by the surrender of Germany, and they were rebuilding their country. The only other person was the Soviet Union. I think the U.S. and British were, and probably the French, I'm not quite sure, were not too keen on having them be either involved in the invasion or, they did want them to be involved in helping them reduce Japan, but when it comes to the occupation afterwards, I don't think anybody wanted them to have a part of it. But this was really a show for the Allied forces, for General MacArthur. And we say Allied forces, it was Allied forces, mostly Australia, I think. Some British, New Zealand.
MacArthur just happened to be the supreme Allied commander in the Pacific, so he was given the job. And as a result, American troops did most of the occupation. However, since it was an Allied occupation zone and not exclusively an American occupation zone, there was also within it an unofficial British occupation zone.
That's right.
Or more accurately, a Commonwealth zone. We're going to learn more about this unofficial Commonwealth occupation zone, but first, I'm going to talk about this video's sponsor, Ridge.
Oh.
I have the same beloved features of being able to carry. This video is based on the
There we
atomic
go.
bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki versus the rapid Soviet invasion of Manchuria, bringing the fear of a possible Soviet invasion of Japan. But this video isn't going to look at how and why Japan surrendered, but rather what the Allies had planned for Japan's surrender.
A lot of people don't realize, I'm sure you guys do, because this is a very intelligent audience, but a lot of people do not realize. They think the bombing of Japan and Nagasaki and Hiroshima with the nuclear bombs brought the end to the war. Well, that was, likely one reason. But one of the other reasons was, and this is, I know, kind of a side note here, but if you look at the invasion of, right up here, if you look at the invasion of Manchuria by the Soviet Union, if you're able to see the timetable on there, and it's kind of hard to see, this was extremely quick. This was, I want to say, like a week. It's been a while since I looked at this, but they moved a lot of tank forces, tank armies over, and they just rolled right over into North Korea. And I think it's just completely overlooked that Japan surrendered because they have long back and forth hatred with with Russia, aka the Soviet Union, in this whole point. But I thought that was it was like you've got to make a decision quickly, because that's sort of the feeling, like these two bombs were not the first one. They weren't sure. They thought it was a large firebomb. Second one, I think they kind of realized it was a nuclear bomb for sure. And then this goes on with the Soviet Union, and it looks like things are ending very, very quickly. And they didn't have a whole lot of, I don't want to say they didn't have a whole lot of tanks. They didn't have some great tanks in Japan. There wasn't a whole lot of need necessarily for tanks. There was need, but they didn't use them the way the Russians did.
While Japan was a member of the Axis powers, not every Allied power was at war with all of them. Some nations only went to war in Europe against Germany and Italy. A few, such as Chile, only went to war with Japan. The Soviet Union had signed a non-aggression pact with Japan similar to Germany, and once Germany invaded the USSR and they got near Moscow, the Soviets weren't going to focus on anything else. They even famously helped save Moscow from falling by providing extra reinforcements from the Soviet forces that were originally stationed along the border with Japanese Manchuria.
Another interesting note, that the Japanese and the Soviets, they've had border disputes. As a matter of fact, there was one, I think, in like 1939. Maybe it was 1940. I think Zhukov was the commander there, and it was a pretty big disaster for the Japanese, which was a change. So the Japanese were not into taking on the Soviet Union. The Soviets were not going to declare war, if I'm not mistaken, on Japan until it was like I think it was August. It was when it came down to it, and that was sort of like a promise of one of the was it Potsdam, I think. Anyway, let's keep going.
But by the time Germany's defeat was close and inevitable, the other major Allied powers had wanted to make sure everyone was willing to be at war with both Germany and Japan. And the Soviet Union was urged to forego their non-aggression pact and open up a new front with Japan. Throughout the war, the Allied powers had multiple conferences with each other, and after Germany's surrender in May of 1945, they had one final wartime conference in July and August 1945, known as the Potsdam Conference. One of the results was the Potsdam Agreement on August 1st, which involved agreeing to the post-war occupation zones of Germany and how they planned to denazify the region. But another event was the similarly named but different Potsdam Declaration that occurred a few days prior on July 26th. In it, the British, Chinese, and Americans agreed that Japan must unconditionally surrender. The Soviets were not added to the agreement precisely because they were still not officially at war with Japan yet. The Soviets at the conference did, however, inform the Allies that they intended to go to war with Japan in August. I bring up these events because one of the terms of the Potsdam Declaration is the intention to have the right to set up points of occupation in Japanese territory to be determined later by the Allies.
That's interesting. I know that when FDR, in the Tehran conference, it was, who is it? FDR, Churchill and Stalin. They discussed unconditional surrender. That was the goal. Germany was either going to, go out fighting like they did and just surrender 100%. There was going to be no separate agreements made. From my limited understanding of what the war aims of the Allied powers were for Japan, it wasn't necessarily the case. I mean, we know that in August, that Japan surrendered because of various whole things like the nuclear weapons, 2 nuclear bombs dropped, the Russian invasion or Soviet invasion, but there was no idea. We were Operation Olympic, which was, or was it Operation Downfall? I think it was the invasion of Japan. Was supposed to take a year, maybe 2, possibly, and it was supposed to. There were a lot of people that were supposed to be killed, and that was the idea. Was, that's the whole reason for the bombs and for all this stuff, was to save these lives. So the war aims, as I understand it, were not clear. Now, if you guys do know, please let me know in the comments and correct me. That's the whole point of this, is to understand how things work, and I shouldn't say how things work. to ask the questions and find the answers. And I don't know that there were war aims.
This means the possibility of a similar occupation partition like that of Germany could have theoretically happened. On the internet, I've seen this map floating around of a supposedly proposed Allied partition plan of Japan, in which zones were to be occupied by the Soviets, Americans, British, and Chinese,
Okay.
with Kyoto and Tokyo each also having occupation zones. However, trying to find the source of this map led me to only a random online article, which itself had no source for this claim. I personally have doubts this would have ever been agreed upon, as not only were the Soviets not a part of the Potsdam Declaration yet, meaning they wouldn't have been included in such early discussions yet, but also there are several documents and messages from American authorities, such as President Harry S. Truman, that were absolutely dead set at not allowing the Soviets to occupy any territory on the home islands.
There it is. Okay,
If
good.
somehow the atomic bombs never happened and the Allies were forced to invade the home islands, the Soviets did have plans for a possible invasion of the northern island Hokkaido, so perhaps they could have forced their own occupation zone. But we'll never know. Regardless, this map, while an interesting hypothetical, is not something I could find substantial proof for being a serious proposal. So for
Okay.
all we know, there was no official proposal for occupation zones of Japan. The proposal to have Japan's home islands under a single occupation zone under the Supreme Commander of the Allied Forces, General MacArthur, was agreed upon by the United States by early August. And with Japan's surrender close by, the Soviets didn't object. Aside from being a little late to the party, there were two main reasons the Soviets did not participate in the Allied occupation of Japan. Firstly, they had managed to seize South Sakhalin and the Kuril Islands, and the Americans were willing to allow the Soviets to fully annex them.
Interesting point, because there's still a bone of contention today.
Secondly, Stalin did not like the idea of any Soviet troops being under the command of an American general like MacArthur. China, meanwhile, was
Well, that makes perfect sense, actually. That's very, very Stalin-like.
content with merely being allowed to re-annex Taiwan, and was much more concerned with resuming their civil war with the communists.
Here's a quick question: was in 1945, August 45? Was it Formosa, or was Formosa the Japanese name for Taiwan, and then Taiwan was the Chinese name for it? I've always questioned that. I never knew.
France had to rebuild its recently liberated country back home and was
Yeah.
in no position to impose anything over the peace in the Pacific regardless.
Right, because France, not only were they rebuilding, they were trying to hold on to their own possessions to begin with. At the end of the war. I mean, French Indochina, I don't know, North Africa, a couple of other places. But I mean, yeah, what was left basically, they were trying to hold on to that.
This meant of the major Allied powers, while the U.S. would conduct the brunt of the occupation, the British and other British Commonwealth countries were the other major participants of the Pacific Theater who could supply men for the occupation. The British set up a British Commonwealth Occupation Force, made up of a mix of soldiers and airmen from the United Kingdom, British India, Australia, and New Zealand in early 1946.
Yeah,
And on
okay.
February 21st of that year, the first troops arrived in Japan. The BCOF was assigned an unofficial occupation zone consisting of the island of Shikoku and 5 prefectures on the western end of Honshu.
You know, I remember this because when the Korean War broke out, this was a hot spot to get troops across the Sea of Japan.
Interestingly, their headquarters was at the port of Kure, less than 25 kilometers southeast of the recently nuked Hiroshima. There were approximately 40,000 troops involved in this occupation force, and at one point made up 25% of the total Allied occupation force in Japan altogether.
Whoa. Okay, so hey, just a quick note for probably more Americans or people from the States. The Commonwealth forces occupied maybe up to 25% of the total occupation forces. That's significant. I didn't think it was that large, but that's amazing. And of course, I think I'm almost positive the Indian forces, they pulled out in 47 when they gained independence.
While the U.S. did occupy the great majority of the country, the areas occupied by the Commonwealth still had over 20 million people, so it was no small contribution.
Sure.
However, the British Empire was in a much more fragile situation after the war than the United States, meaning that this occupation force would quickly dwindle. The entire force was always under an Australian commander, and
Okay.
Australia by far contributed the most.
And that makes perfect sense. It really does.
India withdrew all of its forces in 1947 upon achieving independence, and by the end of 1948, all British and New Zealanders had withdrawn as well, leaving essentially only Australian forces, despite it technically still being a Commonwealth occupation force.
I'm curious why New Zealand left in 1948. I'm sure they didn't. New Zealand didn't have a lot of forces that they were able to use for occupation, but on the other hand, New Zealand never struck me as a very. There was the New Zealand division in North Africa. I think it was a division, but they never struck me as a very that they would militarize only during a war. So I could see them taking things down pretty quick, demobilizing quick.
Further dwindling numbers in the force occurred due to the start of the Korean War in 1950. Their proximity to Korea made them useful for air raids at the beginning of the war, and many soldiers were transferred to the front as well due to their convenient position. Luckily, the occupation of Japan ended up being a fairly easy task, and upon the signing of the Treaty of San Francisco in 1952, the Allied occupation of the home islands ended. The U.S. would still occupy the Ryukyu Islands for several more years,
Right.
but the Commonwealth occupation was officially over. What little was left of the British Commonwealth occupation force was officially placed under a new Commonwealth force in Korea. Overall, the British Commonwealth's occupation of parts of Japan, while not the most eventful or essential part of post-war Japan's transition period, it is definitely an overlooked one.
Yeah.
It's an interesting detail of the occupation and another example of the effort from Britain's dominions in the war. I'm Emperor Tiger Star, and I'll see you guys next time.
So that's interesting. I thought it would get more involved into the actual. I thought they would get more involved into the actual specific places within the occupation zone. Okay, but that's it, and it feels like it took a little while to get to where we need to get to. But that's I didn't know a whole lot of this, and it's one of these things that I was surprised up to 25% were Commonwealth forces in Japan. And one of the other things is, and again, this is for more Americans, that I don't know if they realize that Korea was the Korean War was an international, like a NATO operation. So there were Commonwealth forces there. But yes, at the end of World War II, there were many obligations to holding current territory, especially for Commonwealth forces, mostly very much so for French. And there were no Dutch forces as well, as far as I understand. And they were, was it the Dutch East Indies or something that were taken over? They didn't do anything in regards to the. I don't want to say they didn't do anything, but they were probably again working on. Continental Europe was working on continental Europe. The only one that could do it really was the Soviet Union, and I think that was not a great idea. Now the Australians, this is their more sphere of influence. The Indians, absolutely, 100%. All right, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. I think this is just fascinating. So I'll talk to you soon, and have a great one. I'm off to coach some soccer or football. See you later.